None of these involve a single word aimed in their direction. That's actually the whole point. A narcissist's entire operating system is built to counter things people say and do at them directly. It has almost no defense against things you simply stop doing or start doing quietly, entirely for yourself. Today, we're breaking down 5 of those silent habits, why each one genuinely unsettles a narcissist, and how to hold them not as tactics aimed at provoking a reaction, but as the actual architecture of a life that belongs to you again. Let's get into it. The first habit is simply not filling silence. Most people, out of a mix of habit and discomfort, rush to fill any gap in conversation, especially an uncomfortable one. Over-explaining, softening a statement with extra qualifiers, adding reassurance nobody asked for. A narcissist relies on this instinct heavily, because the things you add into an uncomfortable silence are almost always material they can use. A justification to twist, an anxious tell to exploit, evidence that the silence is working on you. When you simply let a pause sit, unfilled, without rushing to make it comfortable for either of you, you deny them that material entirely. This isn't about being cold. It's about recognizing that silence doesn't actually need to be rescued, and that the urge to rescue it is often exactly what a narcissist is counting on. The second habit is maintaining a completely private inner life. This means simply no longer narrating your internal world to them, not your excitement about something good happening, not your hurt about something they did, not your plans, your doubts, your progress. This can feel almost unnatural at first, especially if openness has always been part of how you show up in relationships. But with a narcissist specifically, an open inner life functions as an open supply line. Every piece of internal information you hand over becomes something they can use, whether to manage you, undermine you, or simply confirm they still have access to what's happening underneath your surface. Keeping your internal world private, not as concealment out of fear, but as a genuinely held boundary, removes an entire category of leverage they've likely relied on for a long time without you ever quite noticing. The third habit is letting your face and body stay genuinely unreadable, not performed neutral, but authentically calm, because you've actually reached a place of internal calm rather than because you're forcing your expression into stillness. We touched on the gray rock concept in an earlier episode, but there's a distinction worth naming here. Performed neutrality, held through gritted effort, is often still detectable, because a narcissist is skilled at reading tension underneath a mask. Genuine, internal calm, the kind that comes from real distance and real healing rather than active suppression, doesn't read as a mask at all because there's nothing underneath it being hidden. This habit isn't really about controlling your face. It's about doing the deeper work that makes controlling your face unnecessary because there's genuinely less charge left for your face to give away. The fourth habit is quietly, consistently removing yourself from situations designed to provoke a reaction, without ever announcing that you're doing it. This might look like leaving a family gathering an hour before things typically get tense, without a dramatic exit or explanation, simply because you've learned the pattern and no longer need to stay and watch it unfold. It might look like declining an invitation that's historically been a setup for conflict, offered with a brief, neutral reason instead of a defensive justification. The power in this habit comes specifically from its lack of announcement. You're not making a statement about leaving, which would still be a form of engagement. You're simply, unremarkably, not present for the parts of the dynamic that used to require your endurance. The fifth habit is releasing the need for them to ever understand your side of things. This is, I think, the deepest and hardest one on this list, because it runs against a very human, very reasonable desire to be understood, especially by someone who hurt you. But holding on to that need keeps a channel open that a narcissist can quietly exploit indefinitely, because as long as some part of you is still hoping they'll finally get it, there's still a transaction happening, still a piece of your peace that depends on something outside your control. Letting go of that need entirely, not performing indifference, but genuinely arriving at a place where their understanding, or lack of it, no longer determines anything about your own sense of resolution, removes one of the last, quietest tethers keeping the relationship's old architecture intact. I want to pause here and name something that connects all five of these, because I think it's the actual point underneath the whole list. Every single one of these habits is oriented toward you, not toward them. None of them are things you do in order to produce a specific reaction on their end. They're things you do because they constitute a genuinely healthier, more self-possessed way of moving through the world. And the fact that a narcissist's psychology happens to find all five of them destabilizing is a byproduct of that health, not the reason for practicing it. In part 2, we're going to look at what actually happens on a narcissist's end when these five habits compound together over time, why silence like this tends to be so much harder for them to counter than anything confrontational, and how to hold all five of these without slipping into performing them, which quietly undoes the entire point. Stick around, because that part is where this becomes something you actually live, not just something you understand. Let's look at what happens when these five habits compound over time, and why silence like this tends to be so much harder for a narcissist to counter than anything confrontational ever was. The core reason confrontation is easier for a narcissist to handle than this kind of quiet withdrawal comes down to something we've discussed across this whole channel. Their entire toolkit is reactive. It requires something to react to, an accusation to deny, an emotion to redirect, an argument to win. Every one of the five habits from part 1 removes the raw material that toolkit depends on. Unfilled silence gives them no material to twist. A private inner life gives them no leverage to exploit. Genuine calm gives them no tension to read and use. Quiet, unannounced disengagement gives them no confrontation to escalate. And releasing the need to be understood removes the one open channel that used to keep them relevant to your internal experience at all. Individually, each habit closes off one avenue. Compounded together over months, they don't just close individual avenues. They remove the entire premise the relationship used to run on, that you were reachable, predictable, and responsive to their usual methods. This is where something specific tends to happen on their end, and it's worth understanding in some detail, because it explains why silence like this often produces a much stronger reaction than direct confrontation ever did. A narcissist whose usual methods keep failing doesn't simply give up gracefully. Their psychology, as we've covered extensively, is built around maintaining a specific self-concept. Someone who is compelling, someone whose presence matters, someone who can move the people around them. Repeated failure to move you through any of their usual channels doesn't just fail to produce the result they want. It actively threatens that self-concept, because your continued calm unresponsiveness becomes, over time, undeniable evidence that whatever influence they once had has genuinely eroded. This often produces an escalation phase before it produces retreat, and it's worth being prepared for that, because it can be disorienting if you expect calm to simply be met with calm. You may see attempts to provoke a reaction become more intense, more varied, more creative, precisely because the quieter, more familiar attempts have stopped working. This isn't evidence that your approach is failing. It's usually the opposite. It's evidence that the approach is working well enough that they're reaching for increasingly desperate measures to restore a dynamic that's genuinely slipping away from them. Understanding this in advance matters, because without that context, an escalation can feel like proof you need to change strategy, when it's actually closer to the last stretch of resistance before the old dynamic finally gives out entirely. Eventually, if the 5 habits hold consistently enough over a long enough period, what usually follows the escalation is a genuine reduction in effort on their end. Not necessarily reconciliation, not necessarily growth, but a kind of practical recalibration where they redirect their energy toward sources that still respond to their usual methods, because you no longer do. This is worth naming clearly, because it's not always a satisfying ending in the dramatic sense people sometimes hope for. It's often quieter and more anticlimactic than that, less they finally see the error of their ways, and more, they've simply stopped investing energy somewhere it no longer produces results, which, while less cinematic, is genuinely the more accurate and more common outcome. Now, how do you actually hold these 5 habits without slipping into performing them? Because that slip is subtle and it undoes the entire point the moment it happens. The test is the same one we've used throughout this whole channel. Would you still be doing this exact thing if you knew, with total certainty, that they would never notice, never react, never even find out it was happening at all? Unfilled silence, held for yourself, is genuine self-possession. Unfilled silence, held specifically to unsettle them, is still, underneath the silence, a performance aimed at their reaction, which means some part of you is still organized around them, just through absence instead of presence. A private inner life, kept because you've genuinely decided your internal world doesn't need to be handed over to people who've misused it, is real. A private inner life kept specifically to make them wonder what you're thinking is still, functionally, a message sent in their direction, disguised as silence. The practical way to check yourself here, in real time, is noticing where your attention actually goes during and after these moments. If you find yourself imagining their reaction, checking for signs it landed, replaying the moment to see if it worked, that's a sign the habit has quietly become performance again. If your attention, instead, stays genuinely with your own life, what you're actually doing, actually feeling, actually building, completely independent of whether any of it ever reaches them, that's the real version. And it's the only version that actually produces the effect we've described across this 2-part episode, precisely because it was never built around producing that effect in the first place. I want to close with the same point I've made across several episodes on this channel, because I think it bears repeating specifically here. The destabilizing effect these 5 habits have on a narcissist is real. And if you've lived through this dynamic, there's nothing wrong with finding some quiet satisfaction in understanding why it works. But the actual value of these habits was never really about them at all. It was about you finally fully occupying your own life, your own silence, your own inner world, your own calm, your own choices about where you spend your time, your own release from needing someone else's understanding to feel resolved. That belongs to you, regardless of what it does or doesn't do to anyone still standing on the other side of it, wondering why none of their old methods work anymore. If you've already been living some version of these 5 habits, quietly, for yourself, without ever needing them to notice, I want you to know that's not a strategy succeeding. That's just you, finally, fully back in possession of your own life, which was always the entire point, independent of anyone watching. If you want more of this, the real psychology underneath silence, boundaries, and everything it actually takes to live fully outside someone else's reach, subscribe to Mind Horizon. I'll see you in the next one.